a look at Yeshua's last Seder, called the Last Supper, often by many people. We refer to it as the Last Seder because it was a Passover Seder, as we know. And we learned a lot of interesting things during that study. And I think it was meaningful to many of you who expressed sort of a, well, I didn't know that kind of attitude, which is great. I love hearing those things when I teach. Now we're going to come to chapter 26 of Matthew, getting towards the end of Yeshua's life. And we know that he just really Matthew just described his last Seder, and now he's going to talk about the short amount of time right after the Seder, which took place at night, so we're still in the evening. So these events took place when the Talmidim went to the Mount of Olives after they sang the Hallel, the praise song at the end of their Seder. And you remember that the fourth cup of the Passover Seder is called the cup of Hallel, or the cup of praise, and it's around that cup that we sing praises unto God. So now we know that we're in the evening, the Seder is over, and Yeshua and the gang went up to the Mount of Olives. And there he says something quite sober to them. He says, "Tonight you will all lose faith in me." What a shock. Even though they were just together a few hours before at the Seder, this must have been inconceivable to them that anybody would lose faith in him or confidence in him or trust in him. They just spent all this time with him and many years with him. So what is going on? Well, you need to realize that Yeshua's words were not just relevant to that moment. Yeshua's words were a prophecy. Because in the prophetic plan of God, that's exactly what would happen. In fact, in Zechariah, we read the words, I will strike the shepherd dead, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. That's Zechariah 13:7. And that's exactly what was going on here. Yeshua understood that here he was going to be crucified soon, and he knew what would happen. So he makes point of this that that the man who's in the Hebrew text of Zechariah, it says the man who is close to him will be the one who would depart from him. Now, people interpret that in different ways, but Yeshua is applying that reference to himself here because he knows what's going to happen soon, that his Talmidim would actually abandon him, particularly his closer in Talmidim, called the Shlichim, or the apostles. They would split. They would not stay with him. And he knew that was going to happen. And that's spoken about in Zechariah, also in the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 53. Please, if you don't know that prophecy in Isaiah 53, it starts a few verses before 53:1. It starts in 52, the end of chapter 52. Please read that. It's the massive messianic prophecy that is so important for us to understand as believers. Well, this was part of God's plan that the Messiah would come, and that the sheep would flee. And just a generation after these events, in 70 of the Common Era, the entire land of Israel was dispersed or sent into the diaspora when they all did flee. Now, in verse 32, he explains that this will take place after he has been raised from the dead, but he will go ahead into the Galil and be with his followers. So even though he was saying bad news is coming, good news is also coming. In verse 33 of chapter 26, Caiaphas, who I love because of his emotional ways, he's a very zealous guy. You remember Caiaphas, he was the one who disagreed that Gentiles could get saved. He just thought, well, they got to be Jews first. But that was his nature. He learned from the great vision of the sheet that we've all studied. But Caiaphas comes up and he boldly says, "I will never lose faith in you, even if everybody else does." Now that's a commendable thing for him to say. But Yeshua says to him, "You will disown me 3 times before even the rooster crows." Now, what does that mean? It was just talking about the meaning of the morning. In a way, yes, but in a way, no. This statement about the rooster is actually something that comes out of the Talmudic writings, and there's a lot of speculation about that. But the Talmudic writings understood that there was a spirit of good in the world and a spirit of evil in the world. And the rooster is one of the animals that became a representation of darkness in the world. It's kind of strange, but Yeshua predicts that sometime before morning dawns, and remember this is evening when he's talking to them, the rooster will crow 3 times. Um, even though Caiaphas said, even if I must die with you, I will never disown you. All the Talmidim said the same thing essentially. But Yeshua understood that maybe they wouldn't be able to pull it off. You know, there's a tendency in humanity for all of us to promise the best, and we promise it thinking that will accomplish the best. We'll do what we say we will do, but so often we don't. And God needs us to do what we say we're going to do. That's why Yeshua said, "Let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything besides that is nothing but trouble." So the message here related to Caiaphas, Peter, is that if you say you're going to do what you're going to do it. Now, Caiaphas did not follow the Lord, and the rooster crowed 3 times before this event took place. We'll pick up in a second, but let's remember that God wants us to do what we say we're going to do. Anyway, in verse 36, now remember, Yeshua's on the Mount of Olives with his Talmidim, and now they come down in a hill to a place called Gat-Shimonin, or Gethsemane, known as Gethsemane, Gat-Shmonim, which is really, the translation of that is Gat, which is the word press, like oil press in Hebrew, and Shemen is oil. So this was the place of the oil press. And why was that? Because it was in a vineyard, not a vineyard, an orchard of olive trees growing nearby. And I think Yeshua chose this place in some way because this was going to be the place of his final prayers before his crucifixion. I don't know, I made up a new word, crucifixion. And maybe Yeshua was identifying with what took place in this garden, and that is oil was pressed to produce olive oil. And maybe Yeshua thought of himself as he would be soon pressed, not literally, but crucified by the Romans. And maybe through his willingness to be pressed or to die, his oil would spread to the world, which I believe is a picture of the Holy Spirit. So he says in verse 37 to his disciples, "Go sit over there while I go to pray." Now, I think about that for a second. This is the Messiah of the Jewish people. This is the Son of God. This is God incarnate saying he wants to go and pray. I think we should learn from this. Did Yeshua need to pray? Yes and no. He could do what he wants. He could call anything into existence he wanted to, but he did, has in his humanity, in his full human nature, he needed to pray. Keep that in mind when you think to yourself, well, I don't really need to pray. God knows my needs. He knows what I want. He knows what I need. No, we need to pray. It's part of our relationship with God that we should talk with him. And Yeshua said that he told his followers to sit over there for a little while, and then he would go and experience a lot of grief and anguish, it says in the text, because the grief and anguish of his upcoming crucifixion and the dark hours after this Passover Seder were pressing hard on his soul. And so he went to this very special place for prayer. Matthew testifies that Yeshua was filled with sadness on verse 38, even unto the point of death. Why? He knew what he was facing. Yeah, he was the Son of God. He was the Messiah, but in his humanity, he was going to suffer more than anyone because the method of crucifixion that the Romans used was almost sadistic, and you could say it was. Their method of execution was as painful as you could imagine. So he begs his inner circle to stay there and remain with him and stay awake with him because he was going to go through a torturous time. So he went and fell on his face and was praying. I'm hoping that you're seeing some of the wonderful uh, artwork that Carrie pulled together to go with my talk. I can't tell whether you're seeing it or not, but I know you are. This artwork is really wonderful paintings by great artists that express the anguish that Yeshua was feeling as he prayed. So keep in mind that he did. Now I see the artwork, but I've lost my message on the screen. So Carrie, I need that back. I don't know how we're going to do that because I'm using only the laptop now. So I need my message back. Thank you. I don't know how we're going to do that next time. We tried it with my tablet and my laptop, and that didn't work so well. But we'll work it out sooner or later. Yeshua in verse 39 says, "If it's possible, let this cup pass from me," he said. Now, a cup in Judaism means a cup of experience. Now, keep in mind, these followers had just spent a Seder with him when they drank 4 cups of the fruit of the vine. So they were really, the idea of cups was very prevalent in their mind because they had just gone through the 4 cups of the Seder. But Yeshua was beginning to feel the anguish coming in his direction and what the death would mean at the hands of the Romans. I will explain that again sometime, but not in this message. Maybe I'll explain that again when we come to the season of his crucifixion, which we do in the spring, as you know. So he says to God, "I wish you could take this cup away from me, but not what I want, but what you want." Yeshua's love and commitment for the people is revealed in these words clearly. Even though in his humanity, he would have gladly passed the cup away and given it to somebody else because of the suffering ahead of him. But he knew he had to do the suffering. He had to do the suffering to purchase redemption for the Jewish people first, but also the entire world as well. So he gladly submitted his prayer and attitude to the Father, since he knew that he had to fulfill God's purpose, which was to redeem his people and the nations from their sins. So he finished the first part of his prayer, and he returned to his Talmidim, where he expected them to be praying with him, and they were all sleeping. How disappointing. He says to them, "Were you so weak that you couldn't stay awake with me for even an hour?" Of course, it was very late. Remember, it was after the Seder. And also remember that these men had just finished 4 cups of wine. So maybe they were more than tired, shall we say. I don't know. But it was a crucial time in his life, and he really wanted his disciples to be with him, to share his pain with them. So he said, "How come you couldn't stay awake and pray? Why couldn't you just stand with me for a little bit?" And then he reminds them in verse 41, he says, "But I understand the spirit might be eager, but the human nature is weak." He knew what they would face soon, and he wanted them to understand that and pray with him, because what happened to Yeshua also happened to not all, but most of his followers. Many of them were crucified as well. So in verse 42, we see that he comes to pray a second time. And he says, "My Father," same words, if this cup cannot pass away unless I drink it, let what you want be done. In other words, I don't want to do this, but I will do this because I know my calling. I know my calling is to suffer for humanity. Well, in verse 43, we find he comes back to the Talmidim. What's happening? They're snoozing. Their eyes must have been so heavy, they all fell asleep. But even in his disappointment, he left them again. He just let them sleep, and they went off to pray for a third time. Third time is always a charm in tradition, but here in the Bible, it's often a very significant number. So the third time he goes off to pray, and he says the very same words that he said before. But he tells his disciples, verse 45, "Go on, keep sleeping, take your rest. The time has come for the Son of Man to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Now, let me ask you a question. How do you think they felt about letting their friend, their teacher, their rabbi, their Messiah down 3 times so that he had to go back to the Lord 3 times for prayer and they were not standing with him? He was feeling let down. And so a lesson to us as well. How do we let down our rabbi, the Messiah? We have to ask ourselves that. He did everything for us. He gave his life for us. We have to remember not to let him down ourselves. But next in verse 47, we find 46, we read about Judah, really leading a group of religious leaders to him to make an arrest. Now, this was not just a mob. This was not just a bunch of violent people. These were representatives of the Sanhedrin, which was the legal body of the Jewish leaders of the temple. And Matthew describes this group as a large crowd carrying swords and clubs from the head Kohanim and elders of the people. So I'm not sure whether the head Kohanim were carrying clubs, but they certainly were sent. These people that carrying the clubs to do the damage were sent by the leaders, the Rosh Kohanim, the Rosh Kohen, the head Kohen, and the elders of the people. You might like this little side note that I have, that the high priest of this time was called Kaninya, or Annas, the high priest. It was said of him that his court was so corrupt that people liked to beat people with clubs. That was their approach to life. They just liked to carry around these clubs, maybe baseball bats, and beat people up. But Judah had arranged to give a signal to them, and that was a signal was with a kiss. The kiss is a sign of a disciple's respect for his rabbi. It was not a weird action. It was not a sign of homosexuality. In Israel, kissing is very common and appropriate between men, actually, to express affection and love. And when you have a rabbi that you like, it was not unusual to express that with a hug and a kiss. Of course, we can't do that anymore during COVID, and it's not something that we practice at. But there was a full moon because it was the end of a month, the beginning of a month. And the sky must have been fairly bright, but they still needed to have the exact person in the middle to go to in the middle of the night. So that is why Judas showed the Romans who the one was that was to be killed by kissing him. Yehuda went straight up to Yeshua and greeted him by saying, "Shalom, Rabbi." What hypocrisy. Shalom, peace, Rabbi. And while Yehuda is kissing him, Yeshua responds with an acknowledgement, "Friend, do what you came to do." You know, this is one of the great ironies of history, that Yeshua would be betrayed by one of his closest Talmidim. At a time when he was receiving that betrayal, he was also fulfilling the work of God. That's really kind of ironic, but it was the way it is. God had to allow this tragedy to happen to redeem his humanity from their sins. Yehuda was not just a pawn in God's plan, but he also was held accountable for his actions. And in situations like this that sometimes are hard to comprehend, we believers need to remember that in our father Abraham, we learn from his words, "The judge of all the earth will do what is just." Genesis 18:25. So even though it sounds terrible and it sounds unjust, the judge of all the earth will do what is just. So with this dramatic act of betrayal, the officials grabbed hold of Yeshua, verse 50, and arrested him. They arrested him. He had done nothing wrong. They arrested him. Now, even the disciples didn't quite comprehend the enormity of what was happening. One of them, Luke says, Caiaphas, even reached for his sword and struck at the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear, verse 51. At that time, it was a natural response. Caiaphas didn't exactly know what was going on, but it was not the response of somebody who really trusted God's plan. That's why Yeshua gently rebuked him and said to him, "Put the sword back where it belongs. His kingdom will not come by the force of man. In fact, Yeshua says the one who uses the sword will die by the sword." If it was God's will, Yeshua could call down, verse 53, call the Father to instantly provide more than a dozen armies of angels to deliver him from this distress, verse 53. But the amazing plan of messianic redemption included betrayal and the ultimate death of Yeshua, the Messiah. Verse 54, and there are many passages in Tanakh that are fulfilled when these things happen this way. He's referring there to Isaiah 53 mainly, and other references to the Messiah ben Yosef, the suffering servant. At this point, Yeshua turns to the crowd members and he challenged them with some very convicting questions. He says, why are they coming against him the way they would come against the leader of a rebellion? He and his followers were not seeking to overthrow violently Rome. They were citizens of Rome, and they were not planning a revolution, although there were those who were called the zealots that did want that. That was not Yeshua's gentle nature. So he kind of challenged them because they were not having a rebellion. So he said, why didn't they arrest him in the openness of the temple court where he was teaching every day? In other words, the usual manner of arrest that was orchestrated so that the prophets wrote may be fulfilled. The Messiah's betrayal came to pass to fulfill every detail of what was prophesied in Zechariah and Isaiah, so much so that all the Talmidim deserted him and ran away. Now, he is now alone. His followers left. They ran away. They didn't know what to do. So he's forsaken by his disciples. And yet he's prepared to complete the final function of his earthly ministry. Remember why? For the salvation of the Jewish people as well as the nations. Yeshua had to die. And he allowed that to happen, even though his human flesh did not want that to happen. Well, next section we come to in verse 26 and verse 57 is what we call the preliminary hearing before Caiaphas. This was not the actual final hearing, it's a preliminary hearing. Let me explain. Caiaphas, or in Hebrew, Caiaphas, was the reigning Kohen Hagadol, the high priest. Matthew records that there would be two distinct legal processes for Yeshua, one by the Jewish authorities and the other by the Romans. The Jewish authorities
your hand was covering this.
The Jewish authorities would determine if something had to go to the Romans. They had jurisdiction over every religious matter except punishment for capital punishment. They could not mete out capital punishment, but they could for other punishments. In the first century, the death penalty was kept by the Romans. The Romans allowed the Jews to live pretty much the way they wanted under their own rules and regulations, but the Romans took control of capital punishment. That's one of the ways they controlled the peoples that were under them. Capital punishment was the prerogative of the Roman government. Now, Matthew here gives us the details of the first part of the legal proceedings against Yeshua. It's not the official trial, but because many of the requirements for the official trial that would have been done are missing. Plus, there's some inconsistencies with the Jewish legal process here. This was a preliminary hearing by the Jewish leadership, subsequently making recommendation to the Roman leaders. So this hearing would naturally seek evidence that would be of greater concern to their Roman oppressors. This, by the way, in the Talmud is described as follows. In the Talmud, which was the writings of the rabbis of this day, it has a tremendous amount of historical information that's good to know about. I am reading from Tractate Sanhedrin 4:1. They hold the trial during the daytime, and the verdict must also be reached during the daytime. A verdict of acquittal may be reached on that same day in the daytime, but a verdict of conviction not until the following day. Therefore, trials may not be held on the eve of the Sabbath or on the eve of a festival day. That's the rules. It must be pointed out that this meeting with Caiaphas took place in the middle of the night after Yeshua's Seder with his disciples. According to the discussion of the Talmud, all capital cases must be tried during the daytime, not during the middle of the night, presumably to ensure a fair and open hearing in the open, in the light, during daytime hours, which is probably a metaphor for the emphasis Jewish judges would put on having legal decisions that were made in the light, so to speak. So this evening meeting, middle of the night meeting, could not have been the final trial. It was a temporary hearing, if you will, a pre-trial hearing by the Jewish people. That's all they could do. On top of that, this hearing took place on a high Sabbath day. It was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a high Sabbath. It's a Shabbat, a Sabbath, but it's a high Sabbath, which is like a double Sabbath. It's a high Sabbath. This would have been a major obstacle for the people, but obviously the people, that the Jewish authorities felt they needed to go through with this sort of emergency situation and have their preliminary hearing, if you will. Moreover, some of the key members of the Sanhedrin, the court, were not even there. Nicodemus wasn't there. Joseph of Arimathea wasn't there. They were members of the Sanhedrin. They were Jewish leaders of the day, and they missed the meeting. They were not there. So Matthew specifies in verse 57, some Torah teachers and elders were assembled for this hearing, and it's noted that Caiaphas followed the group into the courtyard of the Kohen Hagadol with the hope of seeing what the outcome would be. So this was a hearing held in Caiaphas's house, not in the court. This was sort of a preliminary hearing by the Jewish people, which they were allowed to do, but it wasn't the final hearing. So Matthew noted in verse 49 that the head Kohanim and the Sanhedrin were not even at this meeting. So this was not an official meeting of the judicial system of Rome in this day. Instead, it had representatives of some of the religious groups of the Jewish people. It was a meeting during the night at Caiaphas' house. Caiaphas' house didn't have some of the leaders of the court there, and was not done according to the way things should have been done, because it was done on a high Sabbath, and it was done at night, not during the daytime. Well, Matthew 49 says that the group was therefore needed to seek some false evidence, because they could find no evidence against him in this fictitious hearing they were having at Caiaphas' house. They needed some evidence so they could put him to death. That was the goal. They were not seeking truth here. They were seeking a conviction of Yeshua. They had some false witnesses, that they brought two people who came forward, verse 60, with a controversial claim. They made this up. According to them, this man, they were referring to Yeshua, said, I can tear down God's temple and build it again in 3 days. Now, what was going on there? Yeshua did say that, but he was not referring to the temple, the holy temple. He was speaking about his body, which was going to be crucified and yet rebuilt in 3 days. He was referring to his resurrection. But these men, they took this out of context, particularly one of them, and made the point that Yeshua was talking about destroying the holy temple, which I'm sure he could do through a miraculous intervention, but it was not something he would want to do. So this man, it says, this man, and that's interesting, said about Yeshua, which is interesting because he doesn't use Yeshua's name. He refers to him as this man. And I'll tell you this, that nowadays in the Jewish world, sometimes they don't refer to Yeshua as Yeshua, because that means God is salvation, and they don't want to say that. So sometimes they say Yeshu, which is a curse actually. And sometimes they say that man. Instead of this man, they say that man in order to not say his name. We have a lot of work to do to get our people to see the loving Messiah of Israel. So the, uh, these two false witnesses misquoted Yeshua and misapplied what he said to create problems for him. But what has happened? What happens? It says that Yeshua decides to remain silent. Verse 63. He remains silent. He didn't say anything. Now he could have. He could have explained that they misinterpreted what he said. He could have explained that he's the Messiah. He's a loving guy. He's not an enemy of the Jewish people. He's the savior of the Jewish people. But I think he realized by this point that he best off not say anything. And sometimes leaders have to know that less is more. And I think Yeshua finally got the message that it's better to not say anything anymore because anything he was saying was being misinterpreted. This fulfills the prophecy, by the way, in Isaiah 53:7, where it tells us the Messiah would remain silent as he's being crucified. Isaiah 53:7. Well, this must have been terribly aggravating for Caiaphas, because this was an obstacle to his plan. He was hoping to put moves to see the end of Yeshua and get rid of him, not because he had anything particularly against him, but he was a political appointee, and he had to answer to the political leaders of the day. So he's hoping, just let's get rid of this guy. He's too much trouble. I think really that was what was going on. So in verse 63, Caiaphas said he's officially going to put Yeshua under oath. Even using a particular formula in the Talmud that you do if you put somebody under oath. This oath was to intensify that in the name of the living God, he needed to know whether Yeshua was truthfully the Son of God. So he says, I tell you, tell us if you are the Mashiach, the Son of God. He wanted to put Yeshua under an oath, like we say, will you swear to God? That's kind of what was happening here. So Yeshua felt good to answer this very straightforward question, as opposed to all the previous false questions. His response was powerful. He said, the words are your own. He focused not on Yeshua's own interpretation of the question, but on the words of the inquirer for Caiaphas. The words are your own. He turned it right back at him. And he said, what you're saying is true. I am the Mashiach. As such, he had a unique relationship with God as God's son. And if you've never heard that concept before, the Son of God is mentioned in Psalm 2, Proverbs 30, Daniel 7 and 9, and places like that. There are references to the Son of God. And not only that, as the ultimate Israeli, Yeshua was the ultimate Son of God, because keep in mind, Israel, the Jewish people, were considered God's son. So in Daniel, it says, sit tight, because everyone's going to see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of Hagvurah, the power, and coming on the clouds of heaven. These were educated rabbis and priests that were asking these questions. So when he used those words from Scripture, it invoked the appearance of the Messiah. In Tehillim, Psalms 110, the Messiah is invited to sit in the place of honor, Hagvurah, being a Hebrew term meaning the power. So what's happening here is that Yeshua is quoting Hebrew prophecies to these men that really were familiar with it. As I said in Daniel 9, it speaks of a vision of the coming Mashiach coming out of the clouds of heaven, like the Son of God and the Son of Man. So Yeshua was claiming here not to be just a good rabbi or a good prophet or a good guy. He was saying, I am the Messiah sent from God to Israel. Now, this claim of messiahship was indeed controversial within the Jewish community. But it would have been really explosive to the Roman leadership because they were always fearing a political uprising. So why did they want to get rid of him? They thought if he claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God, he would overthrow the Roman government. And the Roman Caesars all considered themselves to be gods, and therefore they didn't want any competition. I mean, let's be practical here. That's what's going on. But so this statement that he said, "Yeah, I am the Son of God, I'm the Mashiach," was tough for the Kohen Hagadol. It says tore his robes. Now, not only is the Roman leadership uh, plotzing or fainting from all this, the Kohen Hagadol, it says, tore his robes when he heard Yeshua say that. Well, blasphemy, he shouted. Guess what? What Caiaphas did, what the high priest did, was against the Torah, Leviticus 21:10. The high priests were not allowed to tear their illegal garments, because to do so sort of allowed falsehood to come into the legal justice system. They had to wear their robes throughout the entire trial as a sign of their commitment to following the Torah, the law of God. It's a sign of utmost grief and like capitulation for someone to tear their garments. And that's what Caiaphas did at this moment. He basically lost it. He could not believe that Yeshua would come out that boldly, knowing he would be crucified for saying it, and say, "Yes, I am the Messiah, I am the Mashiach." And Caiaphas just couldn't buy it. He said, "How could this guy from the Galilee, this guy from the lower class up in the Galilee, be the Messiah? He doesn't fit his own picture of the Messiah, because Messiah, you would think, would be Messiah, son of David, the one who would reign as king and come into Jerusalem riding on a white stallion, not a donkey." So Caiaphas, the high priest, really had a lot to learn, and he did. Now, Yeshua asked, Caiaphas asked a couple of questions of his rabbinic colleagues. He says, "Why do we still need more witnesses?" Now, remember, this is the middle of the night. What is your verdict? And the answers were clear. Yeshua is guilty, and therefore he deserves death. That was their answer. This was the quorum of the council that was convinced that they needed to have the death sentence spoken over Yeshua because of, theoretically, an egregious sin of the Torah. Now, we know that he did not sin at all. Well, Matthew 67 records that at this point things got really crazy. They spit in his face and they pounded him with their fists. This is the shepherd from the Galilee. They're spitting at his face. They're punching him with their fists. Both actions in contempt and rejection. Again, this is in Isaiah 50, not 53, but Isaiah 50 verses 5 through 6. He describes those very actions in a prophetic way. And either way, the aggressors would have thought themselves justified, because they just couldn't buy that this guy could really be the rabbi. So they capped their mockery in verse 68. They were just making fun of him. They spit at him. They punched him, and then he said, "A Messiah to prophesy as to who hit you that time." In other words, if you're the Messiah, you know who hit you. You know everything. They were really mocking him. They were making fun of him. Now, Matthew turns his attention back to Caiaphas. Caiaphas, it says in verse 69, was still sitting outside the courtyard of the priestly home, of the high priest's home. And a servant girl comes up to him and accuses him of being with Yeshua from the Galilee. Now, remember, Peter had sort of tried to keep a low profile because he knew what would happen. He was in a dangerous situation. But he really wanted to know the fate of his master. He did not realize that he would now suffer some severe tests himself. So this woman accuses him of being with Yeshua, and he says, "I don't know what you're talking about," in front of everyone. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even know this guy." That's what Peter, one of his first followers, said. Well, another girl comes up to him. It says in verse 71, it says, "This man was with Yeshua of Nazareth." With even the second accusation, Caiaphas swears, in the sense of an oath, "I don't even know the man." This is shocking to me, that Caiaphas is so fearful that he would deny Yeshua 2 times that he even knew him. I told you before, Caiaphas was a very emotional guy, and I think his emotions are taking over. A little while later, bystanders approached Caiaphas and said to him, "You must be one of them. Your accent gives you away." Verse 73. That's interesting, isn't it? Your accent gives you away. I thought these were all Hebrew people speaking Hebrew. Well, they were, but there were different accents in different parts of the land. In fact, the Galileans, the Am Haaretz, the lower class people who lived up in the north, um, up by the Sea of Galilee, they had a different dialect than the people around Jerusalem, who had a sort of a uppity dialect. In a way, it's kind of like they both spoke Hebrew, but it's like if you heard a Jewish person from Alabama or Florida or the South with a Southern accent talking to a New York Jew like my family, you just kind of can't put it together. When I was growing up, my mother had a very good friend from Alabama, and she was Jewish, 100% Jewish, but she was raised in the South. And I could never get over that she had a Southern accent, because all the accents I ever heard were New York accents because my family's from New York. Um, anyway, so this was the third accusation, because they knew that he was he was the Messiah, and Caiaphas had spent some time with him. Well, Caiaphas took another oath, the third oath, and he even invoked a curse on himself, saying, "I do not know that man." Well, his denial was so significant that immediately a rooster crowed. That's when Caiaphas remembered what Yeshua had said about his denials and the signs of the rooster. Luke also gives us a detail, the Gospel of Luke, about this whole story, when he said at that moment, Yeshua looked directly at Caiaphas when he said those words. Caiaphas must have felt a tremendous weight of conviction, because the text says he cried bitterly. He betrayed his friend, his rabbi, his Messiah. 3 times he denied him because he was afraid to stand up for him. Maybe some of us can relate to that experience of denying Yeshua because of fear. We have to remember that it's entirely human to do that. None of us want to be persecuted or cursed. I remember the times when I first did evangelism on the streets of New York City. I was cursed by my own people for being a Nazi. Can you imagine that? And I thought to myself, what did I get myself into? Maybe I should just leave now, because this is getting out of hand. And, there are stories I'll tell you I told you before, I'll tell you again, where it was kind of scary, literally quite frightening, for me especially, because I was vulnerable to being hit, and I was hit a few times. So, and those are the times you think, well, what am I doing here? Maybe I'll just deny this and get out of here. But I knew I couldn't, because I knew the truth that Yeshua was indeed the Messiah, thankfully, who came to give his life as an atonement for the sins of my people and the Gentiles of the world who trust in him as well. I could not deny him. I could not deny him because he did not deny me. So this is a very interesting part of the scripture, as Yeshua goes through this time of trials, a sort of a preliminary hearing at night, and then even more coming, because and how Caiaphas rejected him because he was afraid. Yet Yeshua kept the plan of God. He even went to his sacrificial death, knowing the pain he would bear, wanted to have the cup taken away, cup symbolizing his sacrifice, his pain, but he knew he had to do what he had to do. So at the close of this message, let me ask each one of us to consider what in our lives, in any way at all, what in our lives denies Yeshua. Is there a way? Do we hide what we believe? Do we avoid telling people where we worship? Do we not want to tell anybody all the wonderful things about him, his teaching, his practices, his life and death for us? We don't want to be ones that deny him like Caiaphas, because Caiaphas wept bitterly when he realized what he had done. So with that, I'll close. And next week we're going to read about Yeshua before the Sanhedrin,